Oh, I always hated this part.
Yeah, this video turned out to be a bit more controversial than I thought it was going to be. So, yeah, that was the first episode of Playing Around. It's something I hope to do more of in the future, where we look at the ups and downs of game mechanics, but I'm actually kind of surprised at how many people just hate the idea of resource cards. A lot of people in the comments were like, but actually resource cards bad, actually, and I admit that was a little disheartening. Part of the point of the video is to help people look at these kinds of game mechanics in a new light, because resource cards get tons of hate. Even though the two most popular games in the world still use them, they get a ton of hate. A lot of people make games specifically to say, oh, I've cured resource cards, which is really what I was trying to address in the video. But I guess a lot of people didn't quite get there, so maybe I did leave a couple of things out. One thing I did not talk about that a lot of people brought up, I kind of glossed over it in the video rather than talking about it specifically, is the fact that dedicated resource cards can cause instances, when they're shuffled into your main deck, they can cause instances where either you never draw the resource cards you need, or you draw only resource cards turn after turn after turn, and that is what a lot of people cite as the big frustration with dedicated resource cards that get shuffled into the deck. And yeah, I get it, that stinks, but a lot of the time, I have to say it, a lot of the time, that can be attributed to a skill issue. I know I'm talking about the luck of cards drawn from the top of the deck as a skill issue, but a huge thing with these kinds of games that stick with dedicated resource cards that get shuffled into the deck is knowing the proportions that you should include. And I admit the starter decks really aren't the best at helping this. The starter decks include about 50% more energy cards. Specifically for Pokemon, they include about 50% more energy cards than a deck actually needs. Normal decks tend to average about 12 energy cards. These contain 18, and even then that's less than 1/3 of the deck. Magic is a little bit different, but one thing I highlighted, I did say that you should have more draw power available to a game where you shuffle the resource cards into the deck. I've actually said that on multiple videos, and I went out of my way to point out the land cards with cycling. It's not just land cards that get cycling. A lot of cards in Magic get cycling. If you need one of those cards and you draw the type you don't want, if that card has cycling, you can cycle it and try again. That is, like Secluded Step is a resource card with a very low cycling cost. If you draw Secluded Step but don't need it, it means you have the resources that you want in play, and spending a little bit to get rid of that resource to take another shot at a draw is how you get around that. And Pokemon, I specifically highlighted the card Professor's Research, which gives you tremendous draw power to try to get around that sort of situation where you're just not drawing the land cards that you need. Like I said, it's a matter of skill and understanding the proper proportions, and there's a learning curve to it. I will admit there's a learning curve to it. A lot of people, when they build their first decks, will build them similarly to the starter decks. And like I say, the starter decks are not the best representation of, let me see, how many are in here? 21. Like I said, this deck, most Pokemon decks are half trainer cards. This one is 1/3 trainer cards and have 12 energy. This one has 18. But a lot of people, they're just starting the game. They think that this is the roadmap to build your deck off of, and so they'll build the deck similarly, but they'll experience a lot of the same problems. And that's certainly a learning curve issue. I'm not saying that dedicated resource cards are perfect. I'm just saying a lot of people give them short shrift, and like, oh, but I might never draw them, or I might draw them turn after turn. Well, that's up to you to not only offset that problem with things like cycling and things like massive draw power, but also to take full advantage of the cards that allow that of the ways to that dedicated resource cards can be made interesting. They can be given all sorts of unique abilities by taking advantage of the privilege that they are in fact dedicated resource cards and have these sorts of quirky, neat benefits. Like legendary lands with special abilities are notoriously difficult to get rid of in Magic the Gathering. Although, speaking of short shrift, one thing people called me out on was that I did give Yu-Gi-Oh! A lot of short shrift in this video. And in fact, I've been giving Yu-Gi-Oh! Short shrift in a lot of videos. And I confess, like I said, it doesn't have any temperance. So, of course, I set out the card Temperance. Haha. I will confess that of the members of the big three, between Magic, Pokemon, and Yu-Gi-Oh!, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is the game I have played the least recently. Like, the last time I made a serious Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck, it was wind-ups, to tell you how long ago that was. I mean, wind-ups are no joke. Wind-up Carrier Zen Mighty is still on the forbidden list. I don't have my super rares on me. I don't have my like wind up cat and stuff around because those are of course in my collector binder. But Wind Up Carriers and Mighty is still on the ban list. Yeah, there's the magicians. Wind Up Carriers and Mighty is still on the forbidden list, and all it does is get out more wind-ups. And that's how powerful wind-ups are, because they basically had their engine taken away. I know Wind Up Magician was limited for a long time too. But still, these are cards that came out, what, like maybe a decade ago? I think I was still living in Texas when I worked on my wind-up deck. But it has been a very long time since I played Yu-Gi-Oh! And honestly, I find Yu-Gi-Oh! A little impenetrable these days. One thing I talked about was how Yu-Gi-Oh! It doesn't really have a form of temperance because it does not use any kind of resource cards to ramp things up. But a lot of people in the comments pointed out that they actually like the fact that they can go essentially from 0 to 60 and nothing flat. They can go full throttle right away in Yu-Gi-Oh! And they like that they can just, go all out pretty much right away without any kind of having to wait to get out their best cards. It's if they got the cards in the hand, if they got the strategy, if they got the gumption, they can get their big cards out in one go. And this does create a bit of a situation where, like I said, a lot of people aren't aware that turn 4 exists anymore, because what happens is you can still brick in Yu-Gi-Oh! This is something that a lot of people said is like you get kind of brick hands with all the resource cards, but you can brick in every game. Game Mino-like has the term grade stuck, which means the same thing. You're stuck one grade lower than your opponent for several turns, or maybe, that gives you a huge disadvantage. Yu-Gi-Oh! has bricking hands. For the longest time, it was basically either you get your entire board set up turn 1, or you're out of the game. So the reason so many games don't make it past turn 4 is because people just scoop because they don't have a chance of winning anymore because they did not get the cards that they need. Apparently that wasn't so much in Tier Laments or when the card Mystic Mine was in legal format. Apparently Tier Laments had a lot of games that lasted longer, and I do like the idea that they're aspiring to have longer games, but the games you play of Yu-Gi-Oh! These days are nothing like the games you played like 20 years ago. Man, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is 20 years old now. I have cards in my collection that are probably older than some people watching this video. About Yu-Gi-Oh! Like I think their biggest power creep, it's not like the fact that monsters have become easier to summon or something like that. The biggest thing I've noticed are all of the cards that you essentially play twice. Like, I'm getting common cards that you play them once and they have an effect from the hand, and then you play them again from your discard pile for another effect, and so many cards do that. It's like, oh, I Solemn Judgment the first effect. Okay, it's gonna play itself from the graveyard for its additional effect, and it's like, but the thing is, because it lacks the temperance of the resource cards, it is instead all about card interaction. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is crazy card interaction, and a card that is so economical that you can essentially play it twice is incredibly powerful in a game where you don't have any resource temperance. Like, Magic has cards that you can play twice as well, but they tend to have, like, a big energy cost, a big mana cost in order to actually make that happen, or they require a lot of setup. Yu-Gi-Oh! Just has cards that just straight up work, but I mean, the trap card in general is a card that is all about interaction, because it's a card that you basically activate in response to something else. You have your hand traps, which are cards you can play from your hand to disrupt an opponent. It's like your opponent, oh, I'm going to set up my whole board on turn 1, and the opponent can just say thank you and drop Max C on the board and say, go right ahead. Although, is Max C still banned? It's crazy. I don't know what's banned and what's not anymore. I mean, cards like Morphing Jar are unbanned. Yatagarasu, one of the first emergency banned cards, was recently made unlimited. That's how crazy the power creep with Yu-Gi-Oh! Has gotten. But it's a very complicated system, and I can understand why a lot of people would find Yu-Gi-Oh impenetrable. I mean, I find modern Yu-Gi-Oh kind of impenetrable because of how everything just kind of strings and chains together. But I get it. There are a lot of people who really like that kind of thing. It means that not really a lot of card games have tried to duplicate that experience. Like D-Spirits here is probably the only one I found that's really trying to copy the experience of Yu-Gi-Oh. Yu-Gi-Oh has gotten kind of bloated. It's why they put out Speed Duel. It's why they're putting out Rush Duels. Is they're trying to have their cake and eat it too. They're trying to have set rotation, but without like actually implementing set rotation by generating smaller formats. D-Spirit so far only has one set out so far, but they have a much smaller pool to work with. They have what I called a life point wagering system, where rather than using breakthrough damage like they do in Yu-Gi-Oh, it's instead when your monsters get destroyed, you lose the life point value of that creature. I've seen it used a couple of times. It was also used in the Dinosaur King card game, but that's a franchise that just kind of didn't take off in America in general. But your stronger dinosaurs cost you more life points when they were defeated. It was a similar kind of thing. Another thing I talked about was other resource types. There is still, I feel, room to innovate on resource systems. The Digimon card game, which borrowed its resource system from the Fire Emblem card game, which never got released in the United States, is a new idea where you risk giving your opponent tons of resources when you play a powerful card. What happens is, like I said, it's like a tug of war on the energy row, and when the energy that you have, when the resources lapse over onto the opponent's side of the bar, then it becomes your opponent's turn. So it's a game about carefully investing and maybe occasionally playing a big card, but you risk giving your opponent a ton of resources on the prayer that they have nothing to capitalize on that with. But it's rare to find a game where you playing cards gives resources to your opponent. There are, as a general mechanic, there's the Yu-Gi-Oh card Appropriate, which lets you draw cards whenever your opponent draws cards out of turn. But as a central game mechanic, just forking resources over to your opponent for the mere act of playing cards is not really something I've seen before. I mentioned some other methods as well. There's life point allocation, Magi Nation, and Vampire the Eternal Struggle, now known these days as Vampire Rivals, have an effect where you have your life point total, and you actually have to invest your literal life points into the things you have on the field. Like in Vampire the Eternal Struggle, you have to give some of your vampire power blood to your minions to keep them going. In Magi Nation, you spend your dream energy to summon and maintain your creatures, and these all count as your life points. Your opponents have to get rid of both the life points on you and on all of your minions in order to actually defeat you. So it's certainly a unique way of doing things. It's an old one, though. Magi Nation came out, I think, over 20 years ago. With Vampire the Eternal Struggle, I think, came out under a different name back during the Wild West era. That's just how crazy it goes. And another one I brought up, and I know a lot of people hate it, is Dexterity-based resource systems. That would be your Bakugans, that would be Battle Claw. I actually really liked Battle Claw. I've said this before, but I love the idea of having to occasionally take a risk. It combines like a strategic card game with a bit of snooker, because what happens is you basically, at the start of your turn, you play a crane game. You basically, these are based on like the claw machines with like the toys inside of them and stuff, and you actually use this claw to slide it along a table and try to retrieve these little toys on the other end. And the number of toys you get count as your resources each turn. You can use them to power up your monsters, or draw bonus cards, or play certain cards that require them as a cost, or put down extra energy tokens. You basically have your pile of toys and your opponent's pile of toys, and they go together to form kind of the snooker table. And you can target some characters to try to grab certain ones. You can try to disrupt the pile. You can mess around. You can go for the safe option and try to grab just one, which is really easy. They just kind of get caught in the center and just pulled back. Or you can try to grab several at once to try to get a really big turn in. There's risk taking. I really like it. I can understand why other people might not like it, because it is kind of gimmicky, Not a lot of people enjoy the dexterity. I like the dexterity. If you watch like serious like games of like snooker or nine ball, you can see that there's a lot of strategy involved combined with the dexterity. Like with snooker, because of how you play snooker, you have to be careful about where the cue ball ends up after you make your shot. So there's actually a surprising amount of strategy in dexterity-based games, and I honestly think it's a realm that hasn't really been explored fully. Battle Claw was more a victim of circumstance. It was the only store that picked it up was a store that had like immediately filed for bankruptcy afterwards. They put it in a weird place, and the show tied to it was only sort of okay. I personally thought it was pretty good, but it was otherwise really kind of gimmicky. But this was an awesome game. If you can find it, a lot of stores, I found it at discount stores occasionally. It shouldn't be too hard to find more of the sets here. Really, if you liked Bakugan or things like that, if you want to try something that's like super different, something that Tabletop Simulator can't hope to test, give this a try. It really is like a genuine physical experience. So yeah, I kind of went all over the place with this discussion, but I hope you enjoyed it. We have, of course, have our D spirits here, and yeah, if you like this, come and join us on Patreon. We recently had our first ever game night, and what we did was we basically, I've set up a bunch of voice channels where people can just kind of get together and show off their games, and we had a big game night where we had some people, they showed off their games on Tabletop Simulator. They also used screentop.gg, which is kind of like a really stripped down version of Tabletop Simulator explicitly for card games that is so streamlined that it functions on browser directly. It's a really cool program that I'd actually never heard about before, but if you're building a card game and you want something that's not so taxing on your computer, like I'm on Macintosh, my computer is perfectly fine for editing video, but for running games and OBS at the same time, it's a bit of a struggle. That's one of the things that stopped me from trying like live streaming or something like that. It's not going to stop me, but, I'll figure something out. But yeah, just $1 per month. I've also added a perk to my $100 consultation tier in that if you're working with a team to put your game together, your whole team gets Discord access under the $100 tag. Maybe I should allow gift Patreon memberships for higher tiers as well. That seems like a good idea. But anyway, of course, thanks to everyone who sponsored me on the Patreon, especially these people at the top here who paid at the $10 above level to have their lovely picture depicted on screen. Although thanks to everyone else as well, my Discord and my Patreon have been growing tremendously these past few weeks, and big love to everybody who shows up. Like I said, if you want to show up for another one of our game nights, we had some pretty awesome games that got shown off on there, and of course then afterwards people can share their own Discords, their websites, their like Twitter pages for the games that they're working on. It's a great way to get critique, feedback from a new market. I know the people who showed off their games walked away with a lot of great information, and all of us had a really good time. I actually have it set up so that if you want to set a demo on your own time, there will be people on there who will probably be able to join that game live. And like I said, it's a ton of fun. Trying to figure out where I should go from here. I'm trying to think of other common game mechanics. If you want to see another game mechanic, if you want to see me like kind of go over the ups and downs of it, hopefully better than I did with resource cards, then feel free to leave it in the comments. And until next time, this is Kodak signing off.